Welcome back to Let's Read Darksiders, the Abomination Vault, by Ari Marmel. I'm BurningDogFace, and this is, of course, my sporadically updated audiobook. I don't normally do shoutouts on these videos, but I would like to give a shoutout to Roshin, who has reached, as of today, 800 straight days of commenting on my videos in order to engage with the YouTube algorithm that likes user interaction. So thank you for that. Big round number. Really puts a smile on my face, I have to say. But, to the business at hand, today we're going to be looking at Abomination Vault Chapter 10, and it's going to be a big important one because, for the first time in the entire history of the franchise, we get all four horsemen in one place. Though I will note that this book was published like 6 years before Darksiders 3 came out, so Fury's personality might not exactly be what you're expecting. Just a heads up. Okay, without further ado, here's Chapter 10. The Abomination Vault, Death said as he finally concluded his recounting of recent events, is one of the greatest surviving secrets of the Nephilim, and also one of the most vile. His voice was oddly distant, almost unfocused. I'd hoped never to hear or speak of it ever again. He stood, back straight and head unbowed, despite his obvious discomfort with the topic, before the triple idols of the charred council. His normally cadaverous skin glowed ruddy in the flickering, infernal light. Although he faced the great visages of fire and stone, his voice was pitched so that everyone present, even those behind him, might hear. And a good thing they did, for they each, with various expressions of fascination or simmering resentment, hung on his every word. War stood furthest from him, near the stairs that led back to the cracked earth below, arms crossed over his chest. The same illumination that granted a false vitality to Death's pale flesh also reddened War's white hair until it blended with his enveloping hood. He had grumbled initially at being summoned back so soon after completing his prior mission, a task whose details Death had not yet heard and wasn't certain he cared about, but his eldest brother's tale had swiftly captured his full attentions. Between those two, her eldest brother and her youngest, Fury stood with left hand on hip. Her eyes, gleaming bright but framed in black tattooing, were narrowed in contemplation. Skin of near ivory white, paler even than Death's, but also far healthier, stood in sharp contrast with hair almost the color of wine, and high-collared leather armor and a slit kilt of a violet darker still. Beyond these, the only other hues to stand out were the gold trim and piping along her armor's edges, and the sharp, almost blinding crackle of the whip, made, apparently, of something that could only be described as a distant and unloved cousin of the Lightning family, hanging coiled at her waist. And speaking of black sheep, the last of the quartet leaned almost indolently against the ring of jagged rocks marking the edge of the council's platform. Armor of form-fitting, gleaming steel encased him entirely, its sleek lines broken only by the heavy cloak that came very near to matching his sister's hair. His own hair, black and haphazardly shorn, framed a cold-eyed face that seemed capable of few expressions that were not some variant of a sneer. He wore a pair of pistols, and under his left arm he carried a grim helm, its full-face visor sinister, predatory, almost insectile in aspect if not in detail. True to his name, Strife appeared irritated by all Death had said, though whether this was a genuine reaction or merely his typical contemptuous demeanor remained unclear. Above them, his presence condoned and even insisted upon by the council, despite Death's strenuous objections, Panoptos flitted side to side like a child listening to an exciting campfire tale. "Funny that we've never heard of it," Strife said. "Can't have been all that important, can it?" "Just the opposite, brother," Death retorted. "You've never heard of it, because we kept its existence hidden even from most of our own. Only the firstborn generation of the Nephilim were aware." 3 frowns greeted that pronouncement. "And after the Nephilim fell," Fury asked him, "why not tell us then?" "Because there was no need. The vault was hidden away, and I wanted it to remain that way." "But why would—" "Enough!" The flames roared high, as though to emphasize the demands of the council, or at least its leftmost visage. "You waste time bickering over the unimportant. Speak, Death!" The eldest of the horsemen nodded. "It was at the beginning, brothers, the early years of the Nephilim's ride across creation, in search of a realm to call our own, long before the four of us split from our people to serve the council. It started, in fact, on the very first of the worlds we destroyed. I doubt you recall much of it. To most of us it held little importance or meaning, save that it was the first. What the Firstborn never told you is that we chose that particular realm as our opening gambit for a reason." Death, normally so impassive, so unshakable, began to pace. "They were called the Ravaiim, that people. Never a numerous race, they were some of the eldest of the Old Ones. Related to Makers, but they were not Makers. They were something different, something more primal." "Dramatic," Strife muttered. "The Ravaiim," Death continued, undaunted, "hailed from an epoch so early in creation that life itself was more fluid than it is today. The lines between craftsman and craft were blurry. The Ravaiim didn't create tools the way the Makers do. They sculpted them of their own flesh and bone. It was a process of months, even years. But with proper training and focus, one of the Ravaiim could remold a hand into an osseous blade, or weave a sculpture from shed strips of his own sinew and skin. Perhaps because of their, shall we say, personal bond with their creations, the Ravaiim weren't just powerful, but imaginative. Many Makers had shaped portions of their realms around them, creating life and sculpting geography to their whim. But the Ravaiim were the first to attempt to shape an entire world for themselves. The first to develop a true society beyond a few small villages. Eons before the Maker's realm became what it is, before the White City, in a very real sense, they birthed the concept of civilization." "How very scintillating," Strife muttered behind his hand through a deliberate yawn. "I can't begin to tell you how much I—" "Assuming you don't want your tongue used for raw materials the next time I have to resole one of my boots," Death said cheerfully, "I suggest you stop moving it." Strife's face went cold at first, then red at Fury's snicker and the curl of War's lip. But he did indeed shut his mouth. "Continue." "Of course. The point I was coming to is that the Ravaiim had great power, but more than that, great potential, and we harnessed it." His pacing ceased, but he remained at one edge of the court, staring out across the fiery landscape. "We knew the Ravaiim could never stand against us. They would prove an easy first victory, but an important one. A powerful symbol to the Nephilim, and to all those other realms and worlds that we would eventually trample into the dust. But we would also make them a tool of that conquest. We knew, even then, that many would rise against us, and some might succeed in matching our own power. We needed every advantage we could acquire. And so, when the Ravaiim were no more, a few select Firstborn gathered all that they had left behind and used it all for parts. Raw materials," he added with a brief glance back towards Strife. "What resulted were the grand abominations. Tools of slaughter, of genocide, world killers, the most powerful, most terrible weapons you can conceive." War started briefly, as though disturbed by a sudden thought or memory, but Death chose to ignore the reaction. Lamentation, he named them. Anathema. Black mercy and white anguish. Gravesire. bleak tranquility, and several dozen more, the weakest of which made any of our prior efforts, Harvester, he said with a vague gesture towards the scythe, Affliction, all of those, look like the first student fumblings of Maker children. I'm not certain I follow, Fury admitted. If the Ravaiim had technology to make such devices, why not build them for use against us? I know some of the firstborn Nephilim were skilled crafters in their own right, but I doubt seriously they could build anything out of the same resources that a society of makers could not. Death nodded. You're right. They couldn't. But they didn't build the grand abominations out of Ravaiim technology alone. That made up only a minor portion of their resources. The Nephilim constructed the grand abominations from the remains of the Ravaiim themselves. Fury looked vaguely sick, war bordering on outrage. Only Strife seemed relatively unperturbed by the announcement. And Panoptos might actually have giggled, though Death could not be certain above the crackling fires. How else do you think we could create relics so potent? We are not makers. Normally our own crafting skills would never have been sufficient. But the peculiar nature of the Ravaiim made the process so much easier. Flesh, bones, organs, all of it went into the forging of these weapons. And with it, an element of the race's essence. All the magic and strength that they devoted to making, all the vicissitudes of their own bodies. More than that, even. The strength of purpose and the potential of the Ravaiim. All the power and glory and magnificence that they would have created had they lived were funneled into the abominations. They're not just organic. In a very real sense, they're alive. Not sentient. They don't think in any way we recognize. They don't communicate with their wielders save through emotion and impression. But they're capable of a base level of judgment. And more than that, they hate. Oh, they hate. As even the demons of the foulest hell can only imagine. For everything that was done to them, everything that was denied them, everything they should have been, they find solace in murder and nothing else. And the vault? Strife asked. He sounded far more polite now, cowed either by Death's threat or by the enormity of the tale. Ah, right, yes. Even the most bloodthirsty of our brethren knew that such weapons could not be set free in creation without safeguards. That's why we never even told the rest of you about them, though I'm sure some of you must have heard rumors of at least a few of the weapons, given how often some of the firstborn used them. War grunted in affirmation even as Fury nodded. We suspected some secret, she said, some object or right of power, but nothing like this. My brothers who created the abominations included a fail-safe, Death continued, some very specific means without which even the Nephilim themselves could not fully awaken the weapons. Some were completely non-functional, some could only be partly roused and a fraction of their power unleashed. But without the proper knowledge, their full potential was utterly inaccessible. And even that, we decided, was insufficient. So some of the same firstborn who forged the weapons set out to create the Abomination Vault, a depository that nobody but us could possibly access. The vault occupies its own separate dimension, a hollow realm, if you will, utterly unconnected to anywhere else, save for one single entrance. We moved that entrance over time, as the Nephilim advanced through creation, so that we had access, but only the firstborn ever knew where it was or how to enter. And now only I know. Then it remains only for you to tell us where it stands. From that point, we can ensure— No. Never had the flames within the great stone idols burned so hot or so high. The horsemen each took an involuntary step back, flinching from the raw power. Each of them save death. Remember how many of your gifts are ours to give or to reclaim as we choose. We do not take disobedience lightly, horsemen. I do not disobey lightly, but I will not reveal the location of the vault, or how to bypass the weapon's safeguards, not even to you. So long as only I know, I can be sure the secret remains safe. Punish me if you will, sap my strength, strip away my powers, strike me down if you must. You only ensure my silence all the more. The fires roared until Death's hair and clothes literally smoldered, and the others couldn't look directly at the visages of the council. 3 godly voices boomed as one, promising the most vile of fates, yet even the threat of oblivion itself would not sway Death's resolve. The charred council finally fell silent, perhaps deliberating the proper penalty for such open defiance. Death, too, said nothing, allowing his masters to come to whatever decision they would. But not everyone remained so calm. "Tell them, brother!" Fury appeared beside him, a pale white hand on his arm. The rustle of crimson and the clatter of armor announced War's arrival on Death's other side a moment later. "You've been gone half a millennium. We'd rather not lose you again." "I appreciate that, sister, but if the Charred Council decides that all my potential use to them is not worth the right to keep one secret to myself, then they must act as they see fit." "What I fail to understand," War said, in what was blatantly an attempt to shift the conversation, "is what threat the grand abominations could pose, if the vault remains hidden and all the abominations are locked within." "That's just the problem," Death interrupted. "They aren't all locked within." The eyes of the triple idols filled once more with flame. "Explain!" "I thought that might get your attention. The bulk of the weapons are indeed within the vault. Over the many eons of the Nephilim rampage, however, some were lost, abandoned on scattered battlefields, or perhaps taken by a truly fortunate foe who never knew what he had. We believed that most of those lost had been destroyed, but of course we could never be positive. Now I'm fairly certain that our enemy, whoever they are, already have possession of at least one, if not more. 2 were lost in the fields of Kothysos, and the pieces that remain there now are insufficient to entirely account for them. And I cannot imagine that our foe would be so foolish as to tip his hand by attempting to breach Eden, in order, one assumes, to search our fallen brethren for more of the abominations, if they didn't already know precisely what trail they were on." "Do you think they've learned how to awaken the ones they have?" Strife asked from behind the gathered trio. "I've seen no evidence of that level of power," Death answered. "I have to assume not. But they're most certainly making every effort." "So be it!" It was from the leftmost head that the pronouncement boomed. "You are correct, horseman. Your usefulness does for now outweigh your insolence. Your punishment shall wait for a more opportune time." "Thank you so much." "For the nonce, you will locate this maker, Belisatra, and anyone else at the heart of this cabal. You will eradicate them and any threat they pose. Above all, you will ensure that none outside the purview of the Charred Council locate the Abomination Vault or obtain the weapons." Death offered a shallow bow, only marginally sardonic. "As I'd intended. It will be done. Do you perchance know anything about Belisatra? I have nothing but her name to go on." "We do not. Whatever her activities, she has never involved herself in anything to threaten the balance or otherwise attract our attention, until now. No doubt you'll come up with something." "No doubt," he muttered as he began to turn away. "Make use of your brethren in this." The eldest of the horsemen froze. I'm not certain that the grand abominations might tip the balance throughout creation in favor of any faction to gain control of them. And you may rest assured that the longer this takes, the greater the number of factions that will take an interest. You can afford neither to fail nor to dally. Leave one of the riders available to deal with any other disasters that may arise. Take the others. Panoptos! Instantly, the many-eyed creature swooped down from above. Yes, my lords? Escort the horsemen from the court. See to it that they have access to any resources they require. Oh, but of course. All of you, then, go! They departed, all 5. Death stood rigid, his shoulders tensing further with every step. Well, Strife said, idly spinning his helm in one hand, this ought to be fun, don't you think? The haft of Harvester creaked in Death's grip. He stepped off the stairway, his boots immediately kicking up soot and cinders in the blasted earth. He broke into a long-legged, distance-eating stride, seemingly with no destination in mind. The others, after an exchange of puzzled looks, moved to keep pace. Columns of fire roared between the motley group and the horizon. Smoke swirled about their heads and feet. Stalagmites snapped off at the base as Death refused to veer from his chosen path. Until, when the court of the Charred Council itself was just another distant bulge in the terrain, he halted. Panoptos, go away. So sorry to disappoint you, Death, but I have my orders. You heard them yourself. You must have heard them. I'm almost positive you were standing right there, unless it was some other grim glowering. Then go over there, Death growled, gesturing with a scythe. Even through the mask, it was clear enough that he spoke through clenched teeth. The 4 of us need a moment to talk. Apparently well aware that he'd pushed about as far as he dared, Panoptos flitted off to one side. Death stared at him. Farther. Muttering something unintelligible under his breath, a clever trick for a creature that had seemingly no orifices through which to breathe, Panoptos darted beyond earshot. The other 3 riders waited as Death froze a moment in obvious concentration. A small patch of smoke rising through the blazing cracks in the earth abruptly turned a sickly green. The cloud expanded, rolling outward from some unseen center, and despair appeared in their midst. Dust, who had his beak tucked under a wing that would have appeared to be asleep, had he not been furtively watching them with a half-lidded eye, was perched atop the saddle horn. So, Fury said, once it became clear that Death was not prepared to start the conversation, who goes and who stays? I go, Death told them. The rest of you stay. That pronouncement ignited a veritable eruption of protest. If you believe for one instant, who the hell do you think you... I'm not sure that... This is not a discussion! War, fury, and strife fell silent at Death's bellow, though each wore an expression suggesting that the argument was not, in fact, settled. In the absence of council orders to the contrary, he said, his voice again calm now that he'd regained their attention, I still command. And I've made my decision. If I require your help, rest assured I'll call for you. Until then, I need you to remain where I know I can find you. Wasting our time? Strife demanded. Accomplishing nothing? Death, Fury said. Surely we can be more useful out there, assisting you, than we can waiting for... Traveling in a group would slow me down, and attract far more attention than I will alone. It's far more efficient for me to track down the enemy on my own, then bring you in. Besides, if Belisatra has managed to awaken one of the Grand Abominations, I'm far more likely to survive contact with it than any of you. Oh, I see, Fury said scornfully. This is to protect us, is it? Among other things, yes. I've never heard such gall. Strife was leaning forward as though it was all he could do not to lunge at his brother. What are you hiding from us? I've told you the plan, Death said, turning towards his mount. Accept it. And if we don't care for your plan, then please, by all means, consider yourself more than welcome to grumble about it while you follow it anyway. Death had reached despair and placed one hand on the saddle horn, dislodging an irate dust in the process, when the dull, metallic click sounded from behind him. He froze, then slowly craned his neck to look back over his shoulder. Strife still held his helm in his left hand. In his right, he clutched a dreadful pistol, its quadruple barrels gaping wide, the hammer cocked back and almost quivering in readiness. War and Fury stood rigid, waiting to see if their interference was required, and perhaps deciding which of the pair they would support. "In the absence of the council, I command," Strife parroted. "Says who? A lot's changed in the 5 centuries you've been away, Death. What makes you think you can just stroll back in after all this time and take over?" Death's hand slipped from the horn as he turned. Leaving Harvester to lie across the saddle, he carefully, methodically, crossed the distance separating him from Strife. Each footstep seemed impossibly clear, despite the muffling of the crumbled dirt and the roaring of the distant fires. He halted scarcely an arm's length from the 4 gleaming barrels, and when he spoke, his voice was preternaturally calm, almost flat. "What makes you think," he asked his brother, "that I can't?" Strife's eyes and his pistol slowly turned downward, weighted down by the weight of Death's scrutiny, aimed almost meekly at the earth. Fury unleashed a hiss of breath, not so much in any recognizable emotion as it was the simple release of building pressure. War grunted something deep in his hood. Their elder brother had already turned away, presenting his back to them, Strife included, without apparent concern. "Did anyone else care to add anything?" he asked as he returned to his horse's side. Oddly enough, nobody did. Good. Death climbed atop Despair, then held himself still just long enough for dust to settle upon his shoulder. "Unless the council assigns you otherwise, I'll expect to find you either here or in your homes if I need call on you." Despair broke into a fearsome gallop, pulling swiftly away from the others. They whipped past a startled Panoptos without pause, heralded by Death's shouted, "Keep up if you can, lackey!" Muttering again, with rather more vehemence than earlier, Panoptos soared after him, wings flapping madly as he struggled to match pace with a rotted horse. Strife and Fury watched the horizon long after Death had gone, various conflicting emotions warring for control of their expressions. But War, who had remained abnormally silent during the entire affair, gazed instead in an entirely separate direction. His face remained hidden from his companions by the blood-red hood, and his thoughts, whatever they might have been, remained his own. And that will do it for Chapter 10. I told you that was a big important one. We finally got to find out just what the Abomination Vault is, and oh boy. Living organic weapons that hate everything and can destroy entire worlds. That's a pretty big doozy. Fun to check in with the other horsemen, even if they were in a sort of beta state. And, I'm looking forward to sharing more of the story with you guys from here. So I'm BurningDogFace, and I will see you on the next episode of Let's Read Darksiders, the Abomination Vault. Later!